Hi, everyone. This week we'll be talking about NGOs and conflict transformation. Since I work with an NGO, Women's Federation for World Peace, USA, I enjoyed this topic. As you can imagine, NGOs can and do have an important impact on conflict transformation. So first, we're going to start off with a definition. So there are many different terms you will hear or you read related to NGOs or kind of sounding very similar to NGOs. So let's just clarify first. NGOs, of course, stands for non-governmental organizations. You also sometimes see INGO, which is international non-governmental organizations. That's usually the big ones like Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders or Oxfam. This term was used first in the UN Charter in Article 71, which established a legal basis for the Economic and Social Council to consult with these types of organizations, which are neither the government nor the for-profit sector. A couple definitions of NGOs. First is from the World Bank. NGOs are private organizations that pursue activities to relieve suffering, promote the interests of the poor, protect the environment, provide basic social services, or undertake community development. And another one from the UNDP. An NGO is a nonprofit organization, group, or institution that operates independently from a government and has humanitarian or development objectives. A few key points here. NGOs work independently from the government. They are also distinct from the for-profit sector, and NGOs typically exist for some kind of altruistic motive. There are many thousands of NGOs, so they all have different types of agendas and activities and programs and even ideologies. But what makes them similar is the purpose of the NGO is to make the world better. They might have different definitions of what better means and how to get there, but they have this kind of higher purpose and higher function. It's not about profit, and it's not the government. They've also been called the third sector because they exist in that space, that neither the government nor the market. The World Bank also further clarifies into two different categories of NGOs. There are operational NGOs. These are organizations which primarily design and implement development-related projects. This could be national organizations. It could be international organizations, those that typically have a headquarters in a developed country, but will carry out operations in developing countries. This also includes community-based organizations or CBOs, which serve a specific population in a narrow geographical area. CBOs are also often called grassroots organizations, and they're made up of people who gather together and work to address their own interests, such as a women's group or a farmers association or things like that. There are also advocacy NGOs, and these are primarily for the purpose to defend or promote a specific cause or to seek to influence the policies and practices of international organizations, such as the World Bank or the UN. Not included here in these definitions, NGOs are also heavily reliant upon charitable donations and contributions, and also on volunteers. That can vary depending on the NGO, but each NGO usually takes in philanthropy, charitable donations, and also relies on volunteers. Another term that you will see often in these days is civil society organizations. Civil society can include NGOs, but it's not a synonym, it's a broader term. According to the World Bank, civil society organizations is a wide array of non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations that have a presence in public life, expressing the interests and values of their members or others based on ethical, cultural, political, scientific, religious, or philanthropic considerations. So this term goes beyond the narrower category of just development-oriented NGOs, and it depicts a broader range of organizations. It could include community groups, women's associations, labor unions, indigenous groups, youth groups, charitable organizations, foundations, faith-based organizations, independent media, professional associations, think tanks, independent educational organizations, and social movements. Some of these may be NGOs, or they may not be. There's currently, since as of 2024 data, there are 6,494 NGOs that have consultative status with ECOSOC. In 1945, when the UN Charter was signed, that number was only 41. And so you can see there's a huge growth. It went from just a few points along our timeline. In 1992, it was 700. So you can see there's a big explosion of this area. But this just applies to those NGOs that have this specific relationship with the United Nations. You know, they have to apply for this status and they have to submit reports. A Women's Federation, also UPF, have this consultative status with ECOSOC. But there are many more, many thousands more NGOs out in the world. The Yearbook of International Organizations, which collected data for 2023 and 2024, which is this is a yearbook published by the Union of International Associations. It gives profiles on 45,000 active nonprofit international organizations in 300 countries and territories. But this also only focuses on the international nonprofits. There are many more national level NGOs. In the US, for example, just one example, there are 1.5 million NGOs, some national, some local, and some international. So you always have to be mindful of definition, even though there is the World Bank and the UNDP definitions. Not everyone you're reading will use these definitions universally. So you just have to understand what they're talking about. Are they talking about civil society organizations, or more specifically, just NGOs? Or are they talking about some overlap between different types of organizations? The nonprofit and the civil society sector as a whole has become a huge industry in and of itself. And I wanted to give you an idea of where the funding for NGOs typically comes from. But this is actually a very difficult task. Each country is different and each NGO is different. And since there are so many, many thousands of them, there isn't a current comprehensive peer-reviewed analysis, at least not one that I have found yet. But the most comprehensive study, which is still cited by others in different ways, comes from the Johns Hopkins Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project in 2003. It's a little old. Maybe there's something more up to date, but I just didn't find it. But it still gives kind of a good picture of where things look. They looked at nonprofits in 35 countries. As you can see, they looked at developed countries, developing countries, and also these transitional countries. At least they were classified this way in 2003 at the time of the study. And thinking about our definition, they looked at the broader definition of civil society organizations. So that included things like health sector. That could be nonprofit hospitals, right? It included, which not usually would you put a hospital as an NGO, but it depends on the definition. Or schools are also nonprofit organizations many times, including, especially in the US. I'm more familiar with that situation. But still, even though they're including the broader definition of all these types of civil society organizations, it can kind of give you a sense. So here are some of their findings in terms of funding. Um, of the 39.5 million civil society workers who are working full-time or equivalent to full-time, 43% were volunteers and 57% were paid workers. So again, this shows a heavy reliance on the volunteers. That number, again, includes just the full-time equivalent, not all the many different volunteers and workers who are doing part-time work. If they included part-time, the total number actually exceeds 190 million people, which is about 20% of the adult population of these countries. So again, just highlighting how big the nonprofit and civil society sector is and has become. In terms of funding, fees for services was the top funding source. In the 32 countries on which revenue data was available, 53% of civil society organization income comes from not from private philanthropy, but from fees for services. Keep in mind that, again, this includes schools and hospitals, so that, kind of makes sense. The government also was a significant portion of funding for the nonprofits that they looked at in these countries. Government grants, also sometimes the government will contract with an NGO or civil society organization to provide a service that the government is not able to provide. So, you give that's the funding comes from that source. And third, overall, for all the organizations they looked at was private giving. That's from individuals, from foundations, and also from corporations, about 12%. There was an exclusion for those NGOs that were specifically working on international assistance. Actually, that number was much higher. They received 35% from private giving and 36% from the government. So this just gives you a sense of where the different types of funding for NGOs comes from. If you look at your own country and nonprofits in your area, it might be a little bit different picture. Or in some cultures, in some countries, there's a different culture around philanthropy and about giving. But generally speaking, NGOs will rely on philanthropy. That's donations from individuals or foundations or corporations. And they will also rely on government grants or contracts. Since there are so many NGOs, the number has skyrocketed in recent year. As you can imagine, there are definitely many NGOs that work in conflict management, conflict resolution, preventative diplomacy, conflict transformation, and all of these various areas that are connected to building peace. NGOs are generally seen to have a comparative advantage compared to the government or the markets to address issues, these types of issues, which contribute to or surrounding conflicts and how to end them. These advantages include these 6 points, generally speaking, and we'll just go through each one. First is an ability to function without being constrained by the narrow mandates of foreign policy. As we talked about in a previous video, the foreign policy of a nation may not be exactly in line with what is best for the citizens of the country where they are getting involved. For example, if the United States funds development projects or funds programs to strengthen democracy in the Middle East, it's not for altruistic motives. There's clearly a foreign policy agenda here. But NGOs generally operate with a more altruistically motivated mission, not for the sake of their own political or economic gain, but for this they tend to genuinely have a desire to help people. And that gives them more freedom to operate based on their principles. Now, number two, many NGOs are able to access areas that are inaccessible to official actors and deal directly with grassroots populations. The UN associates with many NGOs for this reason, because the UN itself doesn't have that connection to the grassroots. So they rely on these NGOs to tell them what's happening on the ground. Is there tension growing? What is the real situation of poverty or education, etc. Um, NGOs tend to have a much clearer connection to people's lives, what they need, and can give that more well-rounded perspective to international bodies like the UN. Third, NGOs can also talk with several parties without losing their credibility. We saw that in our case in the first week of Sant'Egidio. We see all this also in NGOs that supply humanitarian aid during a conflict, such as Doctors Without Borders. They provide care to both sides without, trying to say which is right, which is wrong. And because of that, they're able to deal with both sides and build trust. Number four, and though this may not be true for some of the largest NGOs, but for the most part, NGOs can operate with confidentiality, that is, without the scrutiny of the media or the government or the public. This makes it much easier to pursue their missions and try to actually help people if they're not, kind of under a magnifying glass of criticism. There is pressure, of course, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for the most part, they're able to operate more freely because of this. Number five, because of this ability to connect to the grassroots level, NGOs can also effectively network based on trust and long-standing relationships with civil society in conflict zones. An example of this is the NGO called Search for Common Ground. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's the largest dedicated peace-building organization in the world. It focuses on grassroots first and partners with community leaders, civil society organizations, women, youth, and local institutions in order to prevent violence, reduce tensions, rebuild trust. So rather than coming in as outsiders, this organization works with already existing local religious or civic or community leadership, both formal and informal. They work with the media or television, radio to pursue goals of reducing tensions before they can escalate. And finally, especially for those advocacy NGOs, they can draw upon public opinion and help to organize people into a focused action or advocacy with more long-term focus compared to what governments are typically able to do. With governments, usually a person is in office for a set term. Of course, that's not true for every country. There's different political systems and realities. But when that is the situation in the government, a person sitting in that office, they have a certain term limit. And so they can think within that term limit, right? So doing something more long-term, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line with that perspective is difficult. But NGOs, which have a long-term vision, are more able to focus on advocacy, which has a long-term focus. And this is very, very important because, as we know, the conflicts are not just short-term issues and situations, but also long-term structural challenges that need to be addressed. In terms of conflict resolution and conflict transformation, NGOs will typically work in many different areas. I'm going to go over a few of the different areas that these specific types of NGOs tend to work in. And some NGOs will work in more than one of these areas. There's a lot of overlap. Some provide early warnings activities. that is analysis or communication to raise public awareness about escalating conflicts, and based on that analysis, make recommendations to the UN or to regional organizations about potential interventions. An excellent example of this, of an NGO working in this area, is the West Africa Network for Peacebuilding, which was created in response to the many civil wars that the continent experienced in the 1990s. It has one of its, I guess, systems is called the West Africa Early Warning and Response Network, which works to monitor and report on tense situations, which can escalate into conflict, and then they inform policymakers that, hey, there's a situation here, and it needs to be addressed, right? Based on this, the grassroots connections of the organization, and they have a bottoms-up approach. They've been strengthening the local level, and it has been able to provide clear data and clear reports and policy briefs to civil society organizations, to governments, to intergovernmental bodies, and also UN agencies. This is very helpful because it's hard to intervene or make a difference if you don't really know what's the real situation and what's happening on the ground. And actually, this organization has been so successful in helping to reduce or restrict violence through its methods. Its programs have been adopted by other West African countries very successfully. Some NGOs are active in preventative diplomacy. This is like the so-called track 1.5 diplomacy. Sant'Egidio works in this area. That is governments working with NGOs to support peaceful resolution of a conflict. Another example of an organization that works in this area is the Carter Center, which had a role in working within the Sudan conflict and supporting that resolution in 2016 and 2017. The Carter Center held meetings of government officials, opposition leaders, and civil society members to discuss possible paths to peace. And because the Carter Center was able to provide support in this area where direct government engagement was difficult, and it was also providing humanitarian assistance to the country, it was able to support the peace process at that time. You know, as we have talked about, there are many different parts of a peace process. It's not like a linear step-by-step thing, but you have track 1, track 2, and there's also this track 1.5. NGOs will also help to foster positive relationships across ethnic divides or conflict lines through informal exchanges and joint projects. I think you can solidly place some of the programs that Father Moon and Mother Han have founded and the organizations they have created into this group, such as the Middle East Peace Initiative from the Universal Peace Federation, where Christian, Muslim, Jewish religious leaders were brought to Jerusalem to talk, to connect, to discuss, to pray, and to march. And this was, you know, a time to reconcile and see each other, not as the enemy or as someone else, but as, you know, someone who's like me, see their similarities and work towards reconciliation. Or you can think about the initiatives of the Little Angels when they went to North Korea to perform, and to exchanges with other young people over there. Or the Women's Federation Bridge of Peace Project is another example, I think, in this area where through the project, we bring together two people from conflicting sides, whether that's race, nation, ethnicity, religion, and they meet in forgiveness, and repentance, and a commitment to reconciliation. So there are many different projects like this, and maybe you have been part of something similar. NGOs have also specialized in post-conflict regeneration and peace building. This is a very long list because there's many different aspects of peace building and post-conflict regeneration. It involves a whole bunch of activities, and I think also many of the activities of the organizations that Father Moon and Mother Han have founded are contributing to these various areas, such as UPF, Women's Federation, YSP, the media organizations, art and culture, and so much more. It would take too long to go through this entire list and give you an NGO example of each and every one. But all there's so many aspects, many different aspects, which are crucial for conflict transformation, and NGOs can contribute effectively and very impactfully in this sphere. I just included a couple photos. This is of course one of the interfaith conferences of the Universal Peace Federation. This is part of the work for an interreligious dialogue. This is from actually the school, Women's Federation School in Rwanda. These are young men who were Hutu men and they were soldiers. They were living in hiding on the border, and the World Bank partnered with this Women's Federation school to help them, encourage them to put down their guns, come to school, learn, and create a better future. And they educated 430 former soldiers in this way. That's one of the efforts of demobilization and reintegrating former combatants into society. So, you can pause here, take a look at all these different areas. They're all very important. And chances are there are NGOs that are working in many of these different areas in the countries in which you are looking at in your conflict, your final paper. And finally, NGOs have also campaigned to raise public awareness and also lobbied governments to make changes to arms export control and other economic dynamics which fuel war, such as the case of conflict minerals, for example. One example is Global Witness, one of the very first organizations to bring the issue of conflict diamonds to the international arena and discussion, brought to attention of the international level of how diamonds were utilized to fuel bloody civil wars in Angola, Sierra Leone, and DRC in the 1990s. They launched a global campaign to raise public awareness and hold the United Nations, the diamond industry, and the governments to make a change. At the time, it was estimated that as much as 15% of the global diamond supply came from these areas and were being used by armed groups to raise profits and fund their war. Based on this effort of Global Witness and this global campaign, the Kimberley process was established in order to have more concrete verifications on the source of diamonds being sold and traded. And at the time, millions of dollars that was going to rebel violent groups could be diverted as a result of implementing the Kimberley process, especially in Sierra Leone. There have been loopholes since that time, and actually Global Witness eventually stepped out of the Kimberley process because of how the loopholes were being utilized and exploited, and there was no follow-up to make things better. And the whole process has issues in the long term. And just in general, there's a big problem with the diamond industry, but we don't have time to go into that. But this is just to highlight how NGOs can and do play a role in impacting the economies that fuel war. And that's also not to mention the many ways that NGOs work in areas that are indirectly connected to conflict, right? Such as promoting democracy or improving conditions of poverty and promoting human rights, just to name a few. While there are many well-documented positive impacts of NGOs, there are, of course, challenges. And there are those who even question that whether NGOs really are effective, or is it just an industry? Um, Conventionally, it's believed that NGOs have a greater access and connection to the needs of civil society and to the grassroots. But in some cases, it can actually be like the NGOs and their staff and people involved with the NGO are just another professional elite who are disconnected in reality. We talked about the funding of NGOs. NGOs in general are very reliant on being able to secure funding for their projects. They can't do their work without donations from corporations, from individuals, foundations, or from government grants. So the question is, well, do they really represent the needs and the interests of the people they are trying to help? Or is there a greater motivation to answer to the desires of the donor in order to secure the funding? Large donors are also typically from the global north, from the developed nations. So it just can create this imbalance again. For NGOs working in a conflict region, which is usually facing poverty, an outside donor might have a greater say in what the NGO does or doesn't do, and how they do it. They might have a different perspective based on their perceptions, and that perception could be correct or incorrect. It's this kind of double-edged sword. NGOs rely on the donor funding and have to answer to how that money was spent. And if it's not to the donor's liking, they run the risk of losing that funding. And there's so many NGOs, so there's a lot of competition for funding. But at the same time, the other edge is that NGOs have to and usually really want to honor the needs, the real needs of the people that they are trying to serve. And I think there is an overall trend in the NGO sphere to move away from imposing solutions and imposing projects from the outside and being more mindful of the local strengths and needs and actually empowering people. But it's not the case for every single NGO. There's so many of them. Some do it well and some do it not so well. And there has been a lot of imposition, even if it is well-meaning, of the elites of the NGO world or the elites of the North, the global North or the West, which ended up hurting more than helping, and creating problems when they're not grounded in the local reality and local needs. And again, there's a lot of NGOs competing for a small pool of funding. And so if you can't tailor your programs to donor priorities, you run the risk of not being able to continue your projects. And there's still plenty of challenges to be had. Even there's, in general, in our global society, a bigger gap between those who have and those who have not. So, that bigger gap in economy and access to, socioeconomic wealth, creates another gap of understanding and knowing really what people need and what really will help them and what are their desires. Another criticism against NGOs, it may be questioning some of their supposed neutral relationship with the state or the government. Conventionally, it's said that they are independent, they are neutral, they are removed from the foreign policy or domestic agendas, which can dominate third-party interventions that come from governments. But sometimes there can be a blurring of those lines. Governments can outsource delivery of services to NGOs. For example, in the US, about 20 to 30% of nonprofit revenue is from the government, that is federal or state or local levels. That figure might be different depending on the country you're looking at, and some may be higher, some may be lower. But again, it comes to the question of Who is the NGO answering to at the end of the day? Receiving government money doesn't necessarily automatically mean that they're somehow tainted by the state's agenda now because you received this money, but it can have an impact. Um, NGOs can feel pressure to adjust um, to outside of what they think is truly going on or truly going to help people in order to appease the government donor, um, in order to not lose out on future funding. Government grants can also be short-term project-based. That is overall part of a bigger challenge, a bigger problem, because again, the structural causes of conflict is a long-term investment and needs a long-term perspective and a long-term change. And so the short-term project-based way of going about things is not really conducive for that. If you would like to read more, an excellent critical analysis comes from this article, NGOs, States, and Donors Revisited, Still Too Close for Comfort. You can find it online. Just need to Google the title. It's free. Very interesting. There is another interesting case study from Pakistan about NGOs and voluntary organizations published in 2008. And this case study looked at AID's impact on NGO performance and their ability to mobilize members in Pakistan as kind of an indication of whether these organizations have a substantial connection to the grassroots, or is there like actually a gap? Is that comparative advantage actually seen here? Um, this study is also available online, so you can Google it and check out the entire study. So they basically did a comparative study of NGOs working in Pakistan during a specific time period. They had two questions. One was, is international development aid restricting Pakistani NGOs' ability to mobilize members? And does this outcome bear any relationship with the impact of aid on the motivation of the leaders of these organizations and the organization's performance? They make a distinction between NGOs and VOs, that is voluntary organizations. Both serve constituents or target populations which are external to the organization. So, that's different than, say, a labor union where the members are supporting their own interests. Both VOs and NGOs, the organizations they were looking at, serve a population outside of the organization. But the main difference between these two different types of organizations that they were making a distinction on was the source of the funding. NGOs were funded by development aid from outside of Pakistan, and VOs relied on domestic donations and volunteers. They had 40 total organizations. They looked at the largest organizations within each of these categories, 20 in each. And I just wanted to show a summary of some of their main findings. So looking at some of the main findings in terms of measuring motivation amongst these NGOs and VOs. First, for leader salary, amongst the NGOs, 100% received a salary, and for most of them, it was higher than the comparable government job. Amongst VOs, on the other hand, 100% worked voluntarily, and even they invested their own resources in the organization. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that the leaders of NGOs are selfish or just motivated for personal gain, but it does complicate things. And there have been accusations in especially large NGOs of the leader receiving very large salaries, seemingly too large. In terms of organization origin, among NGOs, only 5 were created in response to a local need. You can see that down here. 8, in fact, were more closely connected to the donor interest and desires. Again, this doesn't automatically mean a disconnect, we have to be careful, especially if we want to avoid imposing an agenda from the outside that's not in line with local customs or cultures or needs or desires. Six of the NGOs they looked at were created after the leadership were exposed to Western education. You know, again, not necessarily a bad thing. They can get the professional development that they can bring back to their country. Um, we often hear about brain drain. That is a challenge when people go, they learn in developed nations, and then they don't return back to their country to give back to their people. But we just have to, be mindful and wonder, okay, is there an imposition of Western values which are not in line with the local customs? We just have to be mindful of that. Amongst VOs, however, they were all founded more closely connected to the local needs, much clearer link to those local needs. Three were initiated in response to a particular incident, and the 17 were created as the founders of the organization saw a need in their very close local community, and then they wanted to address that need. So they created an organization to do that. So you can also see similar trends in the beneficiary populations for NGOs. For the most part, the project was designed first, which can be expected when the donor's agenda is the driving factor. The donor, might think this or that is most important for Pakistan, and we want to do this project, and it's going to be so great, and we have the research and very professionally made and everything like that. And then they look for where to implement. Whereas for the VOs, the existence of the organization itself is connected to the beneficiaries and their needs. In these, there was a need that wasn't being addressed in a particular population in a narrowly defined geographic area. And they looked for how to support it and how can we make a difference here. And finally, in the area of material comforts, there was a big difference. The NGOs were located in very upscale areas, posh areas. They had modern offices, and these offices were not located near the project site, and the majority of the staff did have nice cars. Of course, you need a car to get around to help people. But anyway, but in comparison, the VOs were almost completely opposite. And they're not located in posh areas. 25% had no office building. Those that did have an office building, it was in not the upscale area. And 65%, most of them had offices were connected to the project site, and none of them had the nice four-wheel drive cars. Again, there's pros and cons for both sides, but money always complicates things. And of course, people still need to live and pay their bills. Even people working for these wonderful organizations still need to live and pay their bills. But the waters get muddy, and it gets blurry. Who are you accountable to? With the VOs, it can be more clearly seen in accountability to the beneficiaries, who are the entire motivation for their existence. With the NGOs, they have to balance the desires of their donors, because the donors' desires can make a difference between continuing to run or closing up the NGO. In the interviews, the author even discovered there was this kind of mistrust among people, among government officials and leaders, and the volunteers towards the NGOs, the VO leaders and volunteers, the government, and even amongst people, there was kind of a mistrust towards these NGOs. Are they just in it for the donor aid, or what's their motivation? Even some officials they wouldn't take the complaints of NGOs seriously, thinking it was just, well, they're making all this noise so that they can get more aid from, rich countries. The leaders of these NGOs tended to be very well educated. They know the lingo, which can spark the donor's interests and attention. And this can create a kind of a professional elite, separate from the reality on the ground. That doesn't mean it's always going to be like that, but it's just something we need to know about and be aware of. At the time of the field work, actually, which was in 2003 and 2004, this one issue came up over and over again, which was that the NGOs did not criticize the military government of General Musharraf, who was leading at the time of the study. Since donors, especially Western donors, were interested in promoting democracy, including through NGOs, you would expect that there would be some criticism against the military rule at the time. In actuality, General Musharraf was very supportive of the war on terror. This is the post 9/11 world we're talking about. So Western aid donors, such as USAID, were supportive of his regime, meaning there was a flow of aid. And so not supporting his regime or being too critical of his regime meant there's a threat to ending aid and ending access to donors' funds and ending the development projects. So then the NGOs did not criticize. This is what one leader of a VO that they interviewed said: "We do not like being called an NGO. NGO is a very dirty word. It is like an abuse. NGO people have misused the money like anything. The whole issue is that of intention and integrity. Corruption is phenomenal in there." And again, I just want to remind you that this is one case study of 40 organizations in a particular time period in Pakistan. It's like all case studies, that doesn't mean that we make broad assumptions about all NGOs everywhere. You can also think about how NGOs are viewed and regarded in your country. Maybe it's more positive, maybe it's more negative, maybe your personal experience is different. But this is just so that we can understand there are both benefits and there are challenges to how NGOs can have an impact on conflict transformation, both short-term and also long-term. And we want to be clear about intentions, about motivations, and doing work that is people-centered, not donor-centered. And as you are looking at your particular conflict for your final paper, you might look at if there are NGOs which are active in that region or that country. And do they have a substantial and real connection to the grassroots, or do they mostly take a top-down approach? Grassroots and bottom-up and people-centered, these are very nice sounding buzzwords that are used and tossed around a lot in the literature and the language around NGOs. But what is it like in reality for the people who are living in that conflict and dealing with it? Are the organizations making real changes, which could be helpful in nudging things towards rightness? Maybe they could. Maybe there needs to be an adjustment or better collaboration. Are these NGOs trusted by the local people, or are they mostly seen as corrupt, like this case of Pakistan? Then are there NGO, voluntary organizations, like according to this study's definition, those that are locally founded and locally funded, which could be utilized and mobilized for greater change. Yeah, these are just all different questions and considerations as you're thinking about and looking at NGOs and what they can do, what their limitations are. Actually, there are many women's organizations which have had a big impact in the grassroots level and conflict zones, especially those that are made up of mothers, and because they are tired of seeing their children being sent off to war. and they mobilized for nonviolent protest. We will talk a little bit more about that next week when we talk about women and conflict transformation. And that is all for today.